In the autumn of 2004, a general arrived at a forward operating base in Iraq with a reputation that preceded him. His name was Stanley McChrystal, and he had been brought in to command Joint Task Force 145, a classified military unit that would eventually become known as one of the most lethal and controversial operations of the war. McChrystal was no stranger to special operations. He had spent his career in the shadows, moving through the ranks of military special forces with a singular focus on transformation and precision. What he found when he arrived at that base in Iraq would both confirm his theories about what modern warfare could look like and leave him questioning the cost of achieving it at such scale. The base itself was a sprawling compound of concrete barriers, watchtowers, and windowless briefing rooms surrounded by the dust and heat of the Iraqi desert. The temperature in October could still exceed 40 degrees Celsius, the landscape drained of color, the sky bleached white by the intensity of the sun. This was not a place where conventional warfare had proven effective. The insurgents moved through the population like fish through water, drawing supplies and intelligence from the local population, melting away whenever American forces tried to pin them down. The frustration of military planners was palpable. McChrystal understood that finding them required something different, not more troops, but different thinking, better intelligence, and a willingness to challenge the assumptions that had guided military operations up to that point. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. If you haven't already, make sure you hit the subscribe button to not miss any story. And check out our Patreon in the description. We post full, uncensored stories there. Every graphic detail, every brutal moment, nothing redacted. Stories YouTube won't allow. Now let's get into it. Among the units operating under his command was a British SAS Squadron, a tight group of operators whose training and selection had forged them into something extraordinary. Over the course of 6 months, this squadron would conduct 175 separate missions. When McChrystal learned the scope of this operational tempo, he reportedly remarked that he had never seen anything like it in his entire military career. What had taken place across those 6 months was not merely a series of raids. It was a systematic demonstration of what became possible when intelligence, speed, technology, and human expertise were calibrated into a single machine that operated around the clock. To contextualize this performance, most elite military units conduct major operations on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. Demanding schedules might push a unit to 4 or 5 operations per month. The SAS Squadron was sustaining nearly 6 operations every single night, without respite, without reduction in their precision or effectiveness. This was not improvisation or desperation. This was a carefully orchestrated system where the brigade understood that it could only maintain this tempo by fundamentally restructuring how soldiers rotated through operations, how they recovered psychologically and physically, how the mission command decided to deploy them. The realities of sustaining such an operational pace required a complete rethinking of military logistics and personnel management. Traditional force rotation models, developed for operations conducted at conventional tempo, were entirely inadequate. The squadron had to establish what amounted to a factory system of raid production, where every function from targeting analysis to explosive breach to prisoner processing was optimized for speed. Equipment maintenance cycles had to be compressed to support constant deployment. Supply chains for ammunition, body armor, and medical kits had to operate on a flow basis rather than periodic resupply. The medical section had to anticipate a steady stream of casualties, from minor injuries that could be managed on base to serious wounds requiring immediate evacuation to higher-level care. The Intelligence Fusion Center had to operate 24 hours a day, with analysts working rotating shifts to maintain continuous production of targeting packages. This infrastructure, invisible to anyone who did not understand the mechanics of military operations, was as critical to the squadron's performance as the tactical skills of the individual operators. Without this systematic restructuring of every support element, maintaining even a fraction of the operational tempo would have been impossible. McChrystal recognized that what made the squadron's achievement possible was not merely exceptional operators, but exceptional organization built around those operators to enable their repeated employment at maximum efficiency. To understand what 175 missions in 6 months actually meant, one has to first understand the world in which this squadron was operating. Iraq in 2004 was a country fracturing into sectarian violence. Insurgents and organized militant groups operated within the population, nearly impossible to find through traditional military means. The strategic picture was dire. Groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, were conducting increasingly sophisticated attacks. American conventional forces were too slow, too visible, too inflexible to respond to an enemy that could strike anywhere and vanish. Senior commanders understood they were losing the information war. They could not find their enemies fast enough to engage them. McChrystal believed the answer lay in precision, intelligence-driven, direct action raids. The idea was to move faster than the enemy could adapt. By maintaining constant pressure across insurgent networks, removing individuals faster than they could be replaced, the organization would progressively degrade. This was network theory applied to warfare, understanding that these networks had a limited number of individuals who held the knowledge and authority that made the whole system function. McChrystal was proposing something almost opposite to conventional wisdom: use elite operators at high frequency against medium-tier targets identified through rapid intelligence cycles with abbreviated planning timelines. The men selected for this squadron had already endured the SAS selection course in the Brecon Beacons Mountains of Wales, designed to break candidates through exhaustion, deprivation, and uncertainty. Those who emerged represented the most thoroughly vetted operators in the world, skilled in small unit tactics, marksmanship, languages, survival, and 100 other specialized disciplines. This psychological foundation became essential in 2004 when McChrystal asked them to function in a completely different way than they had been trained to expect. The operational tempo that McChrystal instituted was fundamentally different from traditional military operations. Rather than conducting a raid every few weeks or months, missions would happen multiple times per night, every single night, for months on end. The squadron would split into smaller teams, sometimes into fire teams of 4 or 5 men, and they would strike targets that had been identified through a combination of human intelligence, signals intelligence, and real-time information fusion. The intelligence cycle had been compressed to an extraordinary degree. Where previous military operations might take weeks to develop a target and plan a raid, McChrystal's structure aimed to compress this into hours, in the best cases, minutes. This compression of the intelligence-to-action cycle required rethinking how information moved through military organizations. Instead of intelligence being collected, analyzed, passed through layers of command, and then presented to operational units for decision-making, the new system put analytical capacity and decision-making authority closer to the operational teams. The logistical requirements for sustaining such a tempo were immense. Every operator needed ammunition, meaning supply lines had to be configured to restock constantly rather than periodically. Every operator carried body armor and protective equipment, all of which required maintenance and replacement. Medical support had to be immediately available because the sheer volume of operations meant the law of statistics dictated that some would go catastrophically wrong. The command structure had to be lean and fast-moving, capable of adapting to new intelligence within minutes rather than waiting for formal approval through multiple layers of command. Helicopter assets had to be on constant standby, ready to insert or extract teams at any moment. The entire infrastructure of the base had to be restructured to support this new tempo, which had not been designed into how military bases were typically organized. What made this possible was a fundamental transformation in the way military intelligence was processed and shared. Traditionally, information would move slowly up a chain of command, getting filtered and distilled at each level. McChrystal changed this. He created a distributed intelligence network where operators on the ground had near real-time access to the same intelligence pictures that senior commanders were seeing. He insisted on breaking down the compartmentalization that had historically characterized special operations units. Everyone in the task force had access to a daily database of target information, pattern of life analysis, and tactical assessments. This democratization of intelligence represented a radical departure from the closely guarded information security protocols that had defined military culture. In traditional military thinking, information was power, and power was guarded by keeping information compartmented. Officers at senior levels knew things that junior officers did not know. Enlisted personnel had access only to information they needed to accomplish their immediate tasks. This structure made sense in large organizations where security was paramount and where senior leaders needed to maintain control through controlling information flow. McChrystal's innovation was to recognize that in a network-centric warfare environment, the cost of compartmentation exceeded the benefit. If a raid team was going to act on intelligence within minutes of that intelligence being developed, they needed to understand the broader context. They needed to know what other intelligence existed, what other teams were working on, what the larger picture of the insurgent network looked like. The risk of a security breach was outweighed by the operational advantage of having every member of the task force operating from the same intelligence base. The SAS Squadron operated within this new information ecosystem with startling effectiveness. Sources describe the mechanics of their operations in the following terms. A target would be identified either through captured materials, informant tips, signals intelligence, or pattern analysis. The intelligence would be fed into the system, where analysts would build a tactical picture. Rules of engagement and target verification protocols would be established. A raid package would be assembled, consisting of the assault team, support elements, and a predetermined reaction force for emergency extraction. The entire cycle from initial intelligence assessment to team briefing might consume 3 to 8 hours. Then the team would go out. The pace of this cycle reveals how different McChrystal's approach was from traditional military operations. In a conventional military context, a 3 to 8 hour planning cycle for a raid would be considered extraordinarily fast. Normally, target packages are developed over days or weeks, with intelligence being refined, rules of engagement being carefully reviewed by legal advisors, contingency plans being drawn up, and multiple layers of command approving the operation before it proceeds. McChrystal had compressed this timeline by a factor of 10 or more. This was only possible because the rules of engagement had been pre-established, because the legal authorities had been granted ahead of time, because the teams had been drilled to operate with minimal guidance. The compression came at a cost. The intelligence being acted upon was necessarily less refined, the verification protocols less thorough, the contingency planning less elaborate. This was a deliberate trade-off, accepting higher risk in the individual raid in exchange for the ability to conduct raids at high frequency. The Iraqi context made this trade-off strategically rational in ways that would not apply to other operations. In the summer of 2004, the insurgency was still predominantly concentrated in the Sunni-majority areas of central Iraq, operating through networks that were relatively decentralized but which possessed key individuals who held crucial knowledge and connections. Intelligence showed that insurgent cells could relocate or reorganize within days. A targeting package that took 2 weeks to develop might be acting on intelligence that was already weeks old against targets that had moved to new locations or assumed new operational roles. The speed advantage gained by the 3 to 8 hour planning cycle meant that raids were being executed against targets while the intelligence was still fresh, while the insurgent networks had not yet adapted to the identified threat. The tactical question was not whether to take days to plan perfect raids, but whether to strike at a slightly less perfect target immediately, or to strike a more thoroughly vetted target days later when the opportunity had likely passed. For a network disruption strategy, the immediate strike was almost always preferable, even if it carried higher individual risk. The operational philosophy was network-centric in the military theory sense. Disrupting the structure of the opponent's organization became more important than individual tactical successes. Each raid that successfully removed a network node, even if imperfectly executed, degraded the overall organizational capacity of the insurgency faster than a smaller number of perfect raids against more carefully selected targets. The raids themselves were characterized by speed and precision. SAS teams would hit their targets in the depths of night, moving with practiced silence to the designated location. They would perform rapid dynamic entries, securing the site and detaining individuals of tactical interest. The entire operation from insertion to extraction often lasted fewer than 30 minutes. The tactical methodology was refined through repetition. Early raids were more deliberate, as the squadron learned to move faster, recognize relevant materials quickly, and organize site security more efficiently. The time on target declined to 15 minutes in some cases. The operators learned to photograph documents rather than carry them, to identify key individuals through briefings rather than exhaustive searches. The Iraqi urban environment presented distinct tactical challenges. Most targets were in mixed residential and commercial neighborhoods where civilians lived in close proximity to insurgent safe houses. Iraqi residential compounds with high walls surrounding interior courtyards meant raiders could not see the interior until breaching the outer wall. The SAS operators had to navigate these confined spaces, understanding they might encounter non-combatants while maintaining readiness to respond to armed opposition. What struck McChrystal about this pattern of operations was not simply the tactical competence on display, though that was clearly evident. What reportedly astonished him was the sheer volume. 175 separate missions across a 6-month deployment meant that this squadron was conducting close to one major operation every single day. They were rotating through teams, managing the extraordinary physical and psychological toll, and yet the tempo never seemed to slacken. McChrystal would later observe in various accounts that the endurance and consistency of performance he witnessed was genuinely unlike anything in his prior experience. He had spent his career in special operations. He had worked with the best units the United States military had produced. And yet this SAS squadron's operational performance exceeded what he had believed to be possible. What McChrystal was witnessing was the maturation of a different kind of military capability. For decades, special operations units had been held in reserve for critical missions, used sparingly, preserved for moments when their unique skills were essential. They were the hammer that you brought out only when you had identified the exact nail that needed striking. McChrystal was proposing, and the SAS squadron was demonstrating, that special operations forces could be used as a pervasive, continuous tool, operating at the same pace as intelligence could identify targets. This was a conceptual shift as much as a tactical one. It meant accepting that special operations forces were not a scarce resource to be hoarded, but a renewable tool to be constantly employed. It meant that the bottleneck in counterinsurgency operations was not the availability of capable operators, but the speed at which intelligence could be developed and acted upon. The SAS squadron proved that if you could feed them targets at a sufficient rate, they could process and execute against those targets at a tempo that approached the theoretical limit of human performance. Even exceptional men have limits. The psychological impact of repeated combat operations is often underestimated. The human nervous system, when exposed to the shock of violence, registers this as a profound threat. When triggered repeatedly, the neural pathways that regulate fear become sensitized, leading to a state of sustained hyperarousal that can lead to burnout, depression, or dissociation. The SAS operators faced exactly this challenge. The key to sustainability lay in rotation and ritual. The squadron operated in a rotation where different teams would take the lead on different nights. While one team was conducting a raid, another team was recuperating, and a third team was training or engaged in intelligence analysis. By dividing the squadron into 3 or 4 operational groups, McChrystal ensured that an operator would conduct a mission perhaps 2 or 3 times per week, with other nights devoted to recovery. This allowed the nervous system to reset between operations and provided psychological distance from violence. The rituals that operators developed, specific debriefs, Physical activities, ways of processing experience, became frameworks that prevented trauma from accumulating. The intelligence infrastructure that sustained these operations was a remarkable feat of military organization. At the base where the squadron operated, there existed what was essentially a small intelligence fusion center. Specialists in signals intelligence, human intelligence, imagery intelligence, and pattern analysis worked around the clock to build and maintain the targeting picture. They used databases that had been created specifically for the Iraq campaign, populated with information on thousands of individuals suspected of involvement in insurgent activities. They analyzed patterns of communication, movement, and association. They processed information from informants and captured documents. This information flowed into the system that McChrystal's task force used to select and prioritize targets. The Fusion Center broke down traditional barriers, creating spaces where analysts from different disciplines could see the same problem set and contribute their expertise in real time. A signals intelligence analyst might notice a spike in communications from a particular phone number. A human intelligence collector might have informant reporting about meetings at a specific location. An imagery analyst might have satellite photos of that location at a specific time. In the Fusion Center, these pieces of information were combined immediately, creating a much richer picture than any single discipline could provide. The system was far from perfect. Informants were often unreliable. Imagery could be misinterpreted. Signals intelligence was subject to deception by a sophisticated enemy, but it represented a substantial improvement over the intelligence approaches that had characterized earlier phases of the Iraq War. The criteria for targeting evolved over the course of McChrystal's command. In the early phases, the task force targeted individuals known to be directly involved in attacks against coalition forces. But as the understanding of network dynamics improved, the targeting became more granular. The task force would identify key nodes in insurgent networks, individuals who held the network together through their knowledge, relationships, and authority. Removing these individuals, according to the logic of network theory, would disrupt the functioning of larger organizations. Whether this theory actually worked as intended became a matter of significant controversy in subsequent years. At the time, however, the focus was on execution, and the SAS Squadron executed their assigned targets with devastating consistency. The shift from targeting active operatives to targeting network nodes represented a change in strategic thinking that would have long-lasting consequences. A network node might be someone who does not personally conduct attacks, but who holds knowledge about the network structure, who maintains relationships between different parts of the organization, or who controls resources. Removing such individuals would theoretically create disruption and confusion even if they had not directly harmed coalition forces. The shift to network-centric targeting made the task force more lethal in statistical terms, though it also increased the likelihood of errors and created unintended consequences as removal of certain individuals disrupted social and family networks. The aftermath of raids often revealed intelligence that could be processed and acted upon within hours. Captured computers, documents, and mobile phones contained information that would identify new targets, new safe houses, new meeting locations, and new associates in the insurgent network. This intelligence would be evaluated, prioritized, and fed back into the system. New targets would be added to the queue. New raids would be planned. The cycle would begin again. In this way, the squadron was not simply conducting individual raids. They were operating as part of an integrated system designed to progressively dismember insurgent organizations through sustained, precise pressure. This feedback loop was central to McChrystal's strategy. Each raid generated new intelligence that fed directly into the next cycle of targeting. A captured computer might contain email communications that revealed associates of the primary target. Those associates would be analyzed, their phone records examined, their known gathering places identified. Within hours, they could be added to the targeting queue. Within a day or two, the next raid could be planned against them. This feedback loop compressed the typical military decision cycle dramatically. In conventional military organizations, intelligence gathered from a raid might be cataloged, filed, analyzed through multiple levels of command, discussed in planning meetings, and eventually acted upon weeks later, if at all. In McChrystal's structure, the intelligence from a raid was immediately processed and acted upon. If it was valuable, it was being targeted within the same operational cycle. This meant that successful raids did not represent the end point of a targeting process, but rather the beginning of the next phase of targeting. The insurgent network was being probed repeatedly, and each probe generated intelligence that fed the next probe. The pressure was sustained and iterative. McChrystal's perspective on what this demonstrated became increasingly clear in various statements he made during and after this period. He believed that the demonstration proved special operations forces could be transformed into a tool capable of defeating insurgencies at scale, provided they operated with sufficient intelligence, speed, and precision. The traditional large unit military operations that had characterized the Iraq war strategy seemed inefficient and ineffective by comparison. Here was a small unit, one squadron of perhaps 50 to 80 operators, conducting operations at a tempo that was generating measurable effects on the insurgent network. McChrystal saw in this not merely a tactical success, but a conceptual vindication of an approach to warfare that he had been developing throughout his career. The strategic implications of what the SAS Squadron was demonstrating extended far beyond the immediate context of Iraq. If a small unit of elite operators, properly supported, could generate significant military effects against an insurgent organization, it challenged the conventional wisdom that defeating insurgencies required large conventional forces engaging in counterinsurgency operations that could take decades. McChrystal believed he was proving that a different approach was possible, one based on intelligence, precision, and speed rather than on large numbers of troops and extensive presence. This had profound implications for military strategy broadly. It suggested that the future of warfare might belong to smaller forces armed with better information and operating at higher tempo, rather than to massive military establishments oriented toward conventional conflict. The economic and strategic logic of this approach extended far beyond military theory. Large-scale conventional forces required extensive logistics chains, forward supply bases, large headquarters elements, and command structures that were inherently slow to adapt. The financial costs of stationing tens of thousands of troops in Iraq, supporting them with vehicles, fuel, food, ammunition, and medical facilities had accumulated to billions of dollars per year. The SAS approach, by contrast, required relatively small financial outlays. A few dozen operators, equipped with modern technology but no heavier equipment than a human could carry, supported by a smaller intelligence fusion center and logistics infrastructure, could achieve effects measured in terms of network disruption that had previously required 10 times the number of conventional troops. In an era of potential fiscal constraints, a smaller force with better information could accomplish objectives that would otherwise require a much larger investment of resources. The question of what price was being paid for this operational success was more complicated. The intensity of operations meant the squadron lived in sustained alertness. Sleep deprivation accumulated. The psychological weight of participating in lethal raids night after night accumulated in ways that standard military psychological support struggled to address. The SAS operators were conducting raids inside homes where the markers of civilian life were unmistakable. A bookshelf, a child's toys, photographs on a wall. These mundane objects created cognitive dissonance for men in the business of destruction. The operators developed psychological compartmentalization mechanisms to manage this. They focused exclusively on the tactical task, reducing the operation to mechanical procedures. Clear the doorway, secure the room, move to the next location, identify the target, detain or eliminate. This focus on procedure allowed them to function in the immediate moment. But the price was paid later, when the procedures ended, when adrenaline wore off, when the mind had time to process what the body had been made to do. The targets themselves were diverse. Some were confirmed insurgent commanders responsible for coordinating attacks. Others were individuals suspected of involvement in bombings or ambushes. Some were detained on the basis of association with known insurgents, on the principle that disrupting the network at all points would degrade its overall functioning. The rules of engagement governing these operations were established within the legal framework of counterinsurgency operations in Iraq. Military legal advisors determined which targets could be lawfully struck, but the translation of rules of engagement into the reality of night raids, conducted by men operating under stress and with imperfect information, was a process that left room for error. There were incidents where innocents were killed or detained. There were cases where intelligence proved faulty and the targets that had seemed so important turned out to be less significant than anticipated. The broader impact of these operations on the insurgency itself was debated from the beginning. McChrystal and his supporters argued that the sustained targeting was disrupting insurgent command structures and degrading their organizational capacity. Insurgent activity, measured by the volume of attacks, did decline during certain periods when the task force was operating at maximum intensity. However, the relationship between tactical raids and strategic outcomes in counterinsurgency is notoriously difficult to establish. Did the decline in attacks reflect genuine degradation of the insurgent network, or did insurgents simply adapt their tactics, moving to areas where the raid campaign had less reach? Did the raids generate more recruits for insurgent groups by creating local grievances among families of the detained, or did they prevent attacks that would have created far more extensive casualties? These questions remained contested and difficult to answer. The cumulative effect of 175 raids over 6 months was undoubtedly disruptive to insurgent networks. The removal of key individuals, the seizure of equipment and supplies, the loss of safe houses and staging areas all created operational friction for the insurgency. But insurgent networks in Iraq, while disrupted, never ceased to regenerate. The organizations that had lost key personnel found replacements. Networks that had been fractured reformed with new structures. The supply chains that had been disrupted found new routes. The resilience of the insurgent organization meant that the tactical victories, while real and significant, could not necessarily translate into lasting strategic advantage. What was unambiguous was the scale of the operation and the intensity at which it had been conducted. 175 missions in 6 months meant that the SAS Squadron had expanded the boundaries of what was considered achievable in special operations military missions. They had demonstrated that teams could sustain extremely high operational tempos without immediately breaking down. They had shown that intelligence-driven raiding could be scaled and systematized in ways that previous military doctrine had not fully explored. And they had provided McChrystal with empirical validation for the approach that would dominate American special operations strategy throughout the rest of the Iraq War and beyond. The men who conducted these operations became, in some cases, controversial figures. Stories of their exploits circulated through the special operations community, often taking on a legendary quality. There were accounts reported in various military and journalistic sources of operators who conducted the same raid twice in one night, hitting multiple targets in rapid succession. There were descriptions of teams who moved through targeted buildings with such practiced efficiency that residents barely had time to react before operators had secured the location. These accounts built a reputation that attracted other talented individuals to the special operations world, and that seemed to validate the approach McChrystal was implementing. The reputation extended not just within the special operations community, but throughout the broader military establishment. Junior officers and enlisted personnel understood that the SAS Squadron had accomplished something extraordinary, something that had redefined what was possible. This reputation created an aspiration among others to achieve the same level of capability, to operate at the same tempo, to accomplish the same scale of effects. The demonstration of what was possible became an inspiration to others who wanted to push the boundaries of special operations effectiveness. However, the ethical and strategic questions that these operations raised became increasingly urgent as the Iraq War persisted. The targeting methodology, based in large part on association and network analysis rather than individual culpability, raised concerns among legal scholars, human rights organizations, and some military officers. The reliance on informants, some of whom had personal grievances against those they reported, meant that the intelligence upon which raids were based was sometimes contaminated. The accuracy of this intelligence directly affected whether raids struck legitimate targets or resulted in the detention or killing of innocent individuals. The accumulation of detentions and killings created a context in which ordinary Iraqis increasingly viewed American military operations not as liberation, but as occupation and violence. The perception of Western military operations shifted over time as the repeated raids became more visible to the broader Iraqi population. McChrystal himself would later describe the war as increasingly unwinnable, at least as it was being waged, though this realization came only after years of operations at the scale and intensity that the SAS Squadron exemplified. The transformation of American military culture that McChrystal initiated during his tenure in Iraq had long-lasting effects that extended well beyond the immediate context of the Iraq War. The network-centric warfare approach, the integration of intelligence and operations, the use of technology to compress decision timelines, and the embrace of sustained special operations as a primary tool of military strategy all became increasingly dominant in subsequent years. Other special operations units, American and Allied, adopted similar methodologies. The tempo of special operations globally increased dramatically. By the 2010s, the United States was conducting thousands of special operations raids per year in various theaters across the globe. The SAS Squadron's performance in 2004 had become, in many respects, a template for how modern Western militaries thought about counterinsurgency operations. The approach that the SAS Squadron had pioneered became systematized and scaled across multiple commands and multiple theaters. What one squadron had demonstrated was possible, in 2004 became the standard operating procedure for American and Allied Special Operations Forces in the years that followed. The success, whether measured in tactical terms or debated in strategic terms, established a new paradigm for how special operations forces could be employed in counterinsurgency environments. What McChrystal reportedly said he had never seen before was not merely exceptional tactical performance, though that was certainly on display. What struck him was the demonstration that such a small unit could sustain such an extreme operational tempo while maintaining both tactical effectiveness and organizational cohesion. The squadron had proven something that military theory had suggested was possible, but that had never been demonstrated at such scale and with such consistency. They had shown that given sufficient intelligence, precise targeting, organizational discipline, and access to technology and support, a squadron-sized unit could generate effects that previously would have required much larger forces operating for much longer periods. This was a lesson that would reshape how Western militaries approached special operations for decades to come and would influence strategic planning at the highest levels. The 6 months that the SAS Squadron spent conducting 175 missions in Iraq became, for those involved, a defining experience. For some, it was the apogee of their military career, a period when they were operating at the absolute peak of their capabilities as part of a system that seemed to be achieving remarkable results. For others, it was the beginning of a longer reckoning with the consequences of sustained combat operations and the moral ambiguities of raiding campaigns that, while tactically successful, generated their own forms of blowback and resistance from the local population. For McChrystal, it was validation of his vision for transformation of special operations, confirmation that his theoretical framework could actually work when implemented with sufficient discipline and resources. The extraordinary operational tempo that the SAS Squadron achieved became the proof of concept for an approach to warfare that would come to define American military strategy throughout the subsequent decade and beyond. The question of whether the operations were ultimately successful depends on the metrics used to measure success. If success meant disrupting insurgent networks and generating tactical effects, then the evidence was compelling. If success meant moving closer to the strategic objective of a stable, functioning Iraqi state, the evidence was considerably more ambiguous. The operations continued throughout McChrystal's tenure in Iraq and expanded significantly when he took over command of all American Special Operations Forces. The approach that the SAS Squadron had pioneered became systematized and scaled across multiple commands and multiple theaters. What one squadron had demonstrated was possible in 2004 became the standard operating procedure for American and Allied Special Operations Forces in the years that followed. When McChrystal reflected on that period, he did so with the knowledge that operations at such intensity came with costs that are not fully captured in after-action reports or intelligence assessments. The personnel who conducted the raids carried those experiences forward. Some transitioned to other military roles, some left the service entirely, some continued operating at high tempos in subsequent deployments. The broader impact on the war itself, the region itself, and the global conflict against militant groups would unfold over the following years and decades. Some operators spoke in later interviews of a kind of dissociation, a psychological distance from the reality of what they were doing. Others struggled with moral complications that emerged not in the moment of action, but in subsequent reflection on the broader project they were part of. The intensity of purpose they had felt in Iraq, the clarity of their role and mission, made the transition back to peacetime soldiering difficult for some. Some relationships suffered. Some men left the military entirely. The operational success was undeniable, but it came with a cost that was not always visible or acknowledged in official statistics and military assessments. What was clear, however, was that the SAS Squadron had demonstrated something that fundamentally altered how military leaders in the Western world thought about special operations warfare. They had shown that a small unit, properly equipped, trained, supported, and motivated, could operate at a tempo and scale that redefined the boundaries of the possible. That demonstration would echo through military commands for years to come.